what I really want to emphasize today is that like many other people in many of the different fields that we've touched on during this awesome seminar have emphasized, there is so much need for interdisciplinary research. And by that, I don't mean taking research from one field and applying it to another. I mean fundamentally working together to define and develop and then answer new questions. And I've really found that this is true by directly collaborating with on the ground ecologists and conservationists. We really have been able to see an outsized impact in the work that we've done. So, this has been emphasized a few times, but basically biodiversity is going rapidly down a negative slide. We've lost a massive amount of both biodiversity, but also just animal and plant populations globally. And that's a problem because these things are related to basically every other thing we've talked about. Climate change, public health, food security, and ecosystem services. And particularly when we think about things like terrestrial mammals, a country like Kenya that has such a strong ecotourism industry, we're now in a space where this biodiversity is intrinsically linked to the financial markets in the country. And I'm not the only person who thinks by far that we should be trying to study biodiversity at larger scales. For probably the last 100 years, people have gone out and expanded the ways that they collect data around biodiversity. But really in the last 15, 20 years, with recent advancements in hardware, we've seen an explosion of biodiversity data. Everything from satellite imagery to these low-flying aircraft, like what Forrest was mentioning, like UAVs or that have lots of different sensors on board, on animal sensors. So these are tags or collars that are tracking the behavior and the motion of individual animals over space and time. Things like stationary networks of sensors, camera traps were mentioned. These are static cameras that are sort of monitoring over time, but also bioacoustic sensors, sonar sensors underwater. And then community science has been now a massive increase in data that's coming in. So one example of this is iNaturalist, which is a large-scale online platform for community-driven biodiversity data collection. Basically, any of you can go out and take a picture of any plant or animal you see. That picture will be identified by others in the community. And once consensus is reached, it turns into a research-grade observation that then gets directly transmitted into the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And iNaturalist now has over 100 million species observations globally. So that's great, but now we have a problem because it turns out that there's no such thing as a biodiversity sensor. What you have is a lot of proxy sensors that capture lots of data, and then you need to process that data into the actual biodiversity information, right? It isn't a temperature sensor. It's not some sort of like methane sensor. There is this need to then go through and process the information and extract the scientific insight from the raw data streams. And traditionally, this was just done manually. An ecologist, a scientist, like Forrest or Dino, they would go out and they would maybe place camera traps, and then they would go through all of the data collected by their camera traps, identify the species of bees or ungulates, and then that would then go into their ecological models. I put out a network of camera traps in Laikipia around 2 years ago. Last year, that network collected 10 million images, just one network by one scientist. There's absolutely no way that I would be able to process that data manually, even with hundreds of undergrads. Community scientists, like I said, actually it's more than now 100 million species observations in INAT, and that cannot be identified in any reasonable scale by humans alone. And particularly, we've seen a big increase in aerial wildlife surveys. Right now, actually, the Kenyan Wildlife Service is doing one of the largest elephant population surveys by aircraft that's ever been done. And that, if you collect images from a single flight, it can be 200 terabytes of video. So basically, we can't do this without computer vision. This is something where automation, machine learning actually is just, it is the only way forward now that we're operating on these data scales. But it's not that simple. So, the computer vision community has made really outsized progress in things like, I don't know, putting a filter on your face so that you look like you're wearing a cowboy hat. But these are sort of very specific, limited examples that are often human-centric. You know, they're sort of optimized around data sets that large companies like Facebook or Meta are collecting. And the computer vision community has often been then aligned with these sort of strong financial motivators. What that means is they don't deal with data that's like this. So if you're collecting data in the wild, and particularly data without a human photographer, without sort of that human intelligence in the loop, pointing the camera at the object of interest, making sure it's focused and well lit, you end up with data with strong amounts of occlusion. Essentially, you know, up here, I don't know if you can see, but there's a giraffe hiding behind the tree. There's another elephant back here, and with really poor data quality. So things like fog or poor lighting. And then the other dimension of this is that with sort of these automated sensors, lots of the data could be empty, or definitely empty in the context of the person who collected it. So if I'm studying elephants, this data is not of interest to me. But I think this is another way that AI and machine learning are really opening the door to expanding our understanding. Because while there is not any elephants in these pictures, there is a lot of photos of plants, right? And so I think that there's actually a huge opportunity for bycatch in these data collection streams, where if you build the right machine learning model, you can actually capture scientific information from data collected by other scientists for other purposes and really sort of make the best use of all of the data we've already collected. Another big challenge is that biodiversity data has what's called a long tail. Essentially, most of the data that we have is of the most common species. And then as you go down here, so this is just looking at the first 16 million observations that were collected in the iNaturalist platform. So if you use the rule of thumb that you need around 100 images of a species to be able to train a computer vision model to recognize that species again, then there are around 10,000 species already that were over that threshold. There's an order of magnitude more species that are not. And as we collect more data, we continue to see images of new species. So what this means is that we can't only build machine learning models that are data hungry. We have to start handling that low data regime. We have to be able to recognize things that have only been seen once or twice, which humans are actually really good at. Machine learning models are not. And finally, and maybe most insidiously, biodiversity data is not IID. It's not independently and identically distributed. So, you know, think about just things like migration. If you have some prior over what species are likely to occur in a given place and time, that's fine, but you can't use that prior at a different time of year, because you might actually end up with something that's fundamentally wrong, because, you know, all of the wildebeest have gone back to Tanzania. But so there's things like these spatiotemporal changes, but there's also, if you just look, like there's just not uniform distribution of biodiversity. And what you'll see here, this is an estimate of what's called alpha diversity, just like the number of unique species that exist in a given place. You can see there's a huge a huge amount of that biodiversity in the neotropics. But if you look at the data that we have available, now there's this other dimension of bias. Because if you look at the data that's in the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, you can see that it's really biased towards wealthy countries, right? And it's actually almost anti-correlated to where the biodiversity actually exists globally. And so this is actually, this type of domain shift, the fact that you can't actually collect a data set representative of all biodiversity on Earth. You can't collect a data set that's going to be representative of what those distributions are in 10 years because of climate change. That means we need to be able to measure and try to overcome the way that our machine learning models handle this domain shift. So I'm going to talk about this in the context of static cameras. So this is Wildlife Insights, which Tanya mentioned in my intro. Wildlife Insights is a large-scale collaboration between Google and 30 different NGOs globally. Wildlife Insights currently has data from 43 different countries and around 56 million records. And what's interesting about these static cameras is, one, obviously they're a very widely used sensor for biodiversity monitoring and for conservation. And this is really only scratching the surface. They're estimated to be around like 1 million global camera traps constantly operating. And so, you know, this is cool. And there's also a lot of Wildlife Insights projects in Africa. This is just one from the Dakacha woodland in Kenya. But this technological tool, this is already being used across the continent. And what this tool seeks to do is provide a centralized system for data management and for data sharing. And it's getting at that bycatch question, because it's not just the plants in the background. It's the fact that if I'm an ecologist studying, impala, maybe I don't care so much about the jaguars, but someone who's nearby who has a different sort of network area, they might really care about the jaguar images I collect. And so by centralizing and de-siloing the data, we enable sort of much more scalable conservation research and efforts. But what makes static cameras so complicated is you don't just have that sort of large scale shifts in the distribution of species. What you actually have is a bunch of individual windows into microhabitats. And every single one of those camera locations will actually exhibit its own unique distribution of species. And so what you see here is like, one camera versus others. They all have different subpopulation distributions. That means, maybe in one camera you see a lot of jaguars and another you see none. That's pretty clear. But they also have these fixed backgrounds, which means that the model and the images themselves are really repetitive over time. And there are these other sort of visual correlative factors that, that only relate to single cameras. And what this ends up causing is a drop in machine learning performance when you move to sensors that weren't seen during training. And this is sort of a great example of this fundamental challenge that we see across the board with machine learning. It's related to what Catherine was talking about earlier in terms of the need to build a new model every time you go to a new country. We struggle with generalization. And so here what you're looking at is if you take a camera that images from a camera you have seen during training, your error is significantly and consistently lower, regardless of the number of training examples you have for a species. And these types of distribution shifts and these gaps in machine learning performance are really ubiquitous in any real world application of machine learning. And so I've worked with a really amazing team of researchers to build the first large scale benchmark of real world distribution shift. And this is across, not just camera traps, but things like identifying healthcare images in new hospitals, or identifying different sort of chemical scaffolds. So how do we close this gap? What can we do to make our models better at generalization and better at domain shift? And particularly, why don't we take advantage of what we know about the structure of a given domain? So one thing that we found empirically is that there's really a fundamental trade-off between generality and specificity in machine learning. So if you need a model, if you want a model to identify species, that model will generalize much less than one that identifies animals. And part of that is because if you walk your way up that taxonomic tree, those subpopulation shifts no longer exist. You're allowing the model to sort of learn a general representation of what an animal is. And then that general representation, if you go to a new place and you see a new species, it's much more likely that that species will fall into the general representation of animal than it would be if you end up categorizing and forcing those representations apart and to be much more specific. And the value of this means that you can build a model that can be used out of the box, that can be used without needing to retrain a model, needing to have computer vision expertise for new ecologists on new species in new places. So this is a model that we call the megadetector. I developed it along with Microsoft after we sort of did this initial research study that showed that this was going to generalize well. And this model is now, I think, arguably one of the most widely used and useful machine learning models across definitely the ecology space, but maybe across many other fields as well. And it's because we focused on generalization, understanding what worked now, and then deploying and making that model accessible across the board. The model is now currently used to process data by over 60 NGOs worldwide. We processed 100 million images last year alone. And what this does, what this means, yes, this model is not solving the problem we set out to solve. We wanted to do automated species ID. And what we found was that you can do automated species ID for one project and one person. But if you want that model to work for everyone, then, well, it won't. But you can do something that's incredibly useful across the board that can save ecologists globally a ton of time silting through all of those empty images, which can be 70, 80% of their data. And you make that accessible, and now the impact is significant. And now you enable ecologists to focus on the images of the things they care about. So here, like just one example, we work with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game. They collect around 11 million images a season. And before they started working with us, they were 5 years behind in trying to get through and label their data. And that was just growing. So they were collecting data and then they were making policy decisions that were horribly out of date in terms of what was actually going on in their ecosystems. And now they only have to process around 15% of their images. And that means they're actually able to do that within the year that the images were collected, which means they're now making policy based on real-time information, as opposed to information that's massively out of date. Another example is, Wildlife Protection Solutions now uses this model. They connect cameras directly to the cloud. They send images to the cloud, send them through our machine learning models, and then send real-time alerts to land managers when they find vehicles or people that are in places where they maybe shouldn't be, which helps with wildlife crime and human-wildlife conflict. And then, how do you actually move towards a system that does what we set out to do, that actually identifies species, given the fact that you have these big challenges in terms of generalization and domain shift? So one study that we did, we took what's called a deep active learning approach. And we said, now, okay, you have a lot of data from a lot of places, but you don't have data in the park or of the species that you're interested in. Let's take the features learned by machine learning models trained on lots of these other data, and then we'll go in and we'll use the fact that we know that at a given static camera, there's a ton of visual similarity of what a single species looks like over time. And let's just cluster. We'll use the detections to find all the animals, cluster those, bring them together. And then you have a human just label a few representative examples per cluster. And then you use that as weak supervision across that whole cluster and you retrain your model. And we found that we could get the same performance as a supervised model in significantly less time, with 99.5, in fact, % fewer labels. And another thing you can do is you can actually learn a spatiotemporal prior. What we found is using iNaturalist data that you could learn to predict where and when you're likely to see species, kind of like a species distribution model, though we're not claiming that that's what this is, but that spatiotemporal prior can increase your species identification accuracy by up to 10%. So how do we learn from imperfect data? Now, I said that rare classes are super hard, right? And you could really see that here. You can see that with less training examples, the error is basically 1. So one thing we've looked at is actually improving results on rare classes using synthetic data. And when we did this publication, what we were looking at is actually taking game engines and creating fake data of rare species and then adding that into training. And we found that we could improve the rarecast accuracy by up to 70%. And now with these recent, I'm sure you guys have seen online like Dolly or these different image generation models, we're now considering whether we can use that type of technology to generate the data sort of out of distribution that we might need to get the results. So how would an expert label something like this? I was getting image data sets from ecologists where they had things like this labeled confidently. And I was like, I don't believe you. Like, there's no way you know what that is. But when you actually work together with the experts, they can tell you how they're able to do things that are quite challenging. And what it came out to be was that the spatiotemporal context of a given camera was very, very important when identifying really difficult examples. So here, you're looking at a wildebeest in the fog, but it's a wildebeest because of the size and the space. So we'd actually designed a 2-stage model that was able to capture that same information and incorporate it, and we got significantly better results, particularly on the challenging cases. Last, I'm going to very quickly go through ways that we can think about moving from a perspective of machine learning as a magic wand, where you build a machine learning model and you get results and you use them, to machine learning as part of a participatory system, where you work with the machine learning model to make yourself more efficient and to get to the point where you have results that are good enough. So this is now just only a piece of the puzzle. So one example here is working with that Great Grevy's rally. We've started investigating how do we actually build systems that can enable us to identify individuals not in human captured data, which is nice, but in camera trap data, that's quite hard. This camera trap network is at Impala. We've also built this system that we've called Elephant Book, which is a participatory system that identifies individual elephants through a combination of humans and machine learning. And the cool thing here is that by building a system that enabled human input from the beginning, we didn't have any training data. We built the system that would collect the training data while simultaneously providing the access to the information to the ecologists. As we built up enough data through that system, we started to use the machine learning more and more and start to reduce the effort that the ecologists have to put in. So you start with a system that needs only human input, and you can get to a system that becomes fully automated. We're also looking at efficiently answering new questions. So every ecologist has a different question. I give you species ID, you want to know how old they are. So how do we build representations that really efficiently adapt to new questions that haven't been asked before? All right, so a couple open challenges. First, we need to make use of all of that multimodal data. We're collecting all of these different data across different data streams. And we need to actually figure out how to do that effectively. So this is a project where we're looking at large-scale urban forest monitoring using a combination of satellite imagery and ground level imagery from Google Street View, and using the fact that you have this ground level signal coming in from a sparse number of those trees to help you understand the entire urban forest. We need to incorporate domain expertise into our methods. One way we're doing this is we've learned that elephant identification by experts is often with a lot of social context. They understand the group, then they identify the individuals within the group. So now we're looking at building social priors that help us improve that re-ID, particularly for species that are hard to identify, like an elephant. We need to develop accessible and equitable technology. And here, this is actually a big thing we've run into with collaborators in Africa. Access to large-scale data infrastructure and GPUs is not guaranteed. So what we need to build models that are efficient, models that can run on a laptop, and models that can be used by people who don't have access to incredibly expensive computing hardware. And we need to increase interdisciplinary capacity. So we can't just rely on every ecologist having a friend in the CS department who's going to help them with these things. We actually need to be training ecologists and conservation scientists, and honestly people across the sciences, to be able to apply machine learning effectively and reliably in their fields. And so in this case, we've developed this summer school on computer vision methods for ecology, where we bring in graduate level and postdoc and early faculty ecologists, and we train them on how to build their own computer vision models for their own research questions. And the application is out for next year. So it's due by December 15th. And if anyone is interested in or has students that they think are interested, I think it's a really amazing opportunity. Cool, thank you.